So I've said that I don't ultimately find Descartes' arguments for doubt convincing, at least not as presented here. I think that ultimately Descartes just sets the standards too high. He says, well, you have to rule out completely every possibility, that would, get in the way of you having knowledge. If you can't do that, you can't claim to have knowledge. And as I said, I'm not sure we even have to do that we even have the burden of proof when it's a really ordinary claim, right? I'm now sitting here drinking coffee. I don't know that I have to rule out other possibilities, to say that I know that. To say that I don't is a little bit of a dodge, but even if I do have to rule out other possibilities, it seems to me to set the burden of proof way too high to say, well, I have to show that there's no possibility that any of these things that would show I don't have knowledge are true, right? If I can show that I have very good reasons to think that I'm not dreaming, well, isn't that enough, right? And then, other possibilities, I am in a computer simulation, or some powerful being is just, deceiving me just, for fun. Well, I can't rule those out, but I don't know that I have to take those seriously, right? Any more than the prosecuting attorney has to take seriously maybe it was space aliens, right? So I think Descartes just sets the standards too high, and I don't know that we should follow him in accepting that the standards are that high. Okay, but, if I'm beating up on Descartes, if I'm saying, well, ultimately, this argument isn't convincing, it goes wrong in a way, well, why read him, right? Philosophy is sometimes frustrating. Like I had students say, well, especially in ethics, people will be like, well, I really like this theory of what the right thing to do is now, but I know you're going to tell me what's wrong with it, so I'm already angry, right? I had a student say that. And it is, philosophers will present something and then give it a very hard time. Why do this? Well, I think in a lot of cases, even if a theory is not ultimately convincing, there's often something to learn from it by engaging with it. And I think that's true with Descartes. Because the moves Descartes makes are I think, attractive. I think there's something behind them. They're not just willful, crazy stuff that he decides to do. I think there are reasons that we would want knowledge to satisfy these conditions, even if it ultimately turns out that it can't and doesn't need to. But I also think, more importantly, if you talk to people like conspiracy theorists, flat earthers, or whatever, who believe just really wacky stuff, I think they often make a mistake that Descartes does, or maybe a pair of mistakes that he does. So I want to talk about these, what I think are mistakes, and then I want to talk about why it's worrying, or why it might be disturbing that we can't get what Descartes wants. So the Cartesian mistakes, or what I think are mistakes here. And I think, it's two claims. One is, if you can't prove your claims beyond any possible doubt, then you don't know. If you claim to know something, you have to prove beyond not just any reasonable doubt, you have to prove beyond any conceivable doubt. If there's any doubt that someone could raise that you can't address, then you don't know what you say you know. Two, and I think very closely related, I will accept nothing on authority. I must be able to know and prove for myself. I can't accept any claim anyone else makes on the basis of some kind of authority. I have to be able to see for myself, right? And, this was part of what Descartes wanted to do because the authorities had been wrong for so very long, or people were at least doubting them. So use this skeptical method, rebuild something that you personally can see the truth of everything. You don't need to rely on the claims of others who claim some kind of authority. Now look, I think these are mistakes not just in Descartes because they end up with this sort of skepticism, right? Skepticism being the claim you don't know anything. But I think conspiracy theorists often accept both of these, or at least one or the other, right? And I'll give you an example. Like when I was in grad school, this woman I was in grad school with was dating this idiot who believed just loads of conspiracy theories, right? And, she brings the Fosse department would always have this sort of weekend retreat thing. All the grad students would go out there and, she brings this idiot. I think it was a long distance relationship. And the dude gets a couple beers in him and of course, the stupidity flows, right? I mean, among other things, he thought that the moon landing was a conspiracy, right? And, this was back in the early aughts. We didn't know what an edgelord was, right? But this is basically just an edgelord before we knew what they were, right? A dude who would hang out on internet forums and just provoke people and be an idiot, right? And look, so, we kind of have an argument like this, right, with this dude, right? The moon landing didn't happen, and a normal person would say stuff like, well, there's video, lots of people witnessed it, there were astronauts who tell us they were there were all the people at all the different NASA stations who worked on it. And of course, this idiot would say, well, that could be faked, right? There could be a conspiracy. And then any normal person would say, look, conspiracies, that stuff's really hard to fake, right? It's not just that they had, video. It's not just that they had film of it. It's not just that they broadcasted to people's TV. People pored over it, right? Idiots like you have been looking for evidence forever, and they haven't found any real good evidence, right? Not only that, it was during the Cold War. If the Russians could have shown this was fake, they would have loved to have shown it was fake, and they would have, right? What's more, conspiracies are really hard to keep up, right? Lyndon Johnson used to say that there's no such thing as a secret known by only two people, especially in Washington, right? The thought being people will blab, right? And the more people who know, the more likely someone is to blab. To do a conspiracy like this, you would have needed thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people. The odds that every single one of them could keep their mouth shut is just astronomical, right? There's actually mathematical formulas for how likely, I forget the assumptions they make for how likely a conspiracy is to come out within a certain time frame. And I think any involving thousands of people, it's basically months, maybe weeks, right? Even with 2 or 3 people, eventually, people assume it'll come out. It just takes a lot longer. All right. Finally, there's a reflector on the moon. It's not just NASA. Independent groups have shot lasers at the moon, and the reflector bounces the laser back, right? There's even an episode of The Big Bang Theory where some idiot's doubting the moon landing, and they do this, right? I don't think you could actually do it from a rooftop setup like they do in the sitcom. Yeah, big shock, right? Sitcoms are not accurate scientifically. But independent groups have done this. It's been verified. So you tell all this stuff to this idiot, and his response is, oh, sure, but there's at least a possibility it's fake, right? Maybe all those independent groups that have shot lasers at the moon are in on it. We think the Russians were against America in the Cold War, but maybe they were really in on it, and they were on the same side for some reason. And all those conspiracies, I mean, you just said yourself, it's really unlikely tens of thousands of people would keep a secret, but it's not impossible, right? So, you haven't shown that there's no possibility the moon landing was fake, so you don't know. A normal person would say, well, that's really far-fetched. That's really unlikely. That's just crazy. And somebody like this would say, as he in fact did say, well, but you have to admit it's possible, So you think it happened, but you don't know because it's possible it was faked. And my opinion is it didn't happen. So, man, we just have our opinions, right? And notice what this guy is trying to do. He's trying to put on equal footing his crazy nonsense, which has no support, with this claim that the moon landing occurred, which has loads and loads and loads and loads of support, right? It's not just that you both have your opinion because you can imagine doubts to the moon landing. People who think the moon landing occurred know that. People who come up with crazy theories about a soundstage are just wrong, right? But he's pushing these sort of Cartesian doubts to try to put his crazy speculation on the same footing with careful thoughts about history that have a lot of evidence, right? That's just silly. This young would-be edgelord, like, he can't just be like, oh, the moon landing didn't happen because I can cook up scenarios where it's all faked and you can't show they're false, right? But that sort of is the Cartesian standard, right? You have to show that every possibility that would show you don't have knowledge is false. If you do that, then I think, you're going to give up the game to these people. Their final retreat will just be, well, you don't know, right? And with the moon landing or the flat earth, it's just silly, right? People, it's like an adult believing in Santa Claus. It's kind of silly. It's kind of sad. But there's no harm to it, right? But with other theories, there are harms to it, right? The reason I'm so harsh on this dude, the reason I keep calling him an idiot was, among other things, it wasn't just he doubted the moon landing. He also denied the Holocaust, right? Denying the moon landing is silly. Denying the Holocaust is awful, and it's also very potentially harmful, right? And he'd make the same moves. All the evidence you could give for it happening, he had come up with some far-fetched scenario to doubt it, and then just, well, you don't know, right? Now, look, I'm not saying Descartes was a conspiracy theorist. He sure as heck wasn't. And Descartes lived in an age when conspiracy theories were even more popular and even crazier than they are nowadays, right? You had this, break between the Catholic Church and the Protestants, and both sides just love to spin wacky, wacky conspiracy theories about each other, right? Descartes didn't go in for that. But what I'm saying here is that the sort of things he wants in a theory of truth seem to be the sorts of things that a lot of conspiracy theorists assume too. And I think it gets you to a bad place, right? It's a sort of mistake to grant these assumptions. And notice too, not just this absolute certainty, but this claim, I will accept nothing on authority, right? People like this guy, if you look at not just Wikipedia, which is not a reliable source, but you look at Encyclopedia Britannica, you look at the newspapers from the 60s or the 40s or whenever, you look at the history books, and they all tell you the Holocaust happened, the moon landing happened, right? And this dude will just say, well, you're just taking it on other people's say-so. You're not like me, you need to do the research and verify it for yourself, right? I'm never sure what doing the research looks like if you don't trust any of the actual sources that you would use to do research, but who knows, right? But again, this rejection of all possible authority and making up your mind completely for yourself, relying on no authority, it seems to be what a lot of people who believe wacky things do, and it seems to get you into a very bad place very quickly. So, I think thinking about what's going on in Descartes can help us to diagnose some of the really big errors in thinking people seem to make. And I just think, there is something worrying about this, though. Like, look, if you can't rule out every possibility, there's always some chance you're wrong. And at least to some degree, It might be a very small degree, but at least some degree, if you can't rule out all possibilities, if you actually know it, you get lucky in that it turns out to be true, right? And this seems kind of disturbing to me, right? Knowing something can't be purely a matter of luck, right? You can't just guess and get it right and say that you knew something. You can't just, have no reason for it, make a lucky guess. But, so it needs to be not just all luck, but I think we're going to have to admit that luck plays some role. I mean, the difficult question is, how much of a role can luck play and still be knowledge? I don't know. That's a hard question, but I think we have to admit it plays some role. But that's worrying, right? That your claims to know anything could depend on you getting lucky, even a small degree of luck. I do think that's worrying, and I do see why Descartes would have liked to do away with that element of luck. I don't think it's possible, and I think trying to do so gets you to some crazy places, but I understand very much why he wanted to do this, right? It worries me that there might be huge scientific errors none of us will ever know because we just can't given our situation, right? Or historical errors or other stuff. But I don't see any way around it. And the larger issue here is that I think we do have to rely on authority. We have to, at some point, trust some sources and take what they say is true, right? And that's very disturbing, right? I'm giving conspiracy theorists a hard time, and I'm giving Descartes a hard time, but this thought that we have to take on trust what anyone says, even an authority, even a reliable news source or a scientific authority, that does bother me, right? Look, I think what's going on here is this desire for what you might call autonomy in knowledge, right? Autonomy being, independence, freedom, standing on your own 2 feet. And it does seem, that in what we claim to know or accept as true, we should have autonomy, right? We should stand on our own feet. We should make the decisions for ourselves. The problem is there's just so much going on in the world that I don't know that this is possible. And if you reject all authority and want to just figure out everything yourself, it doesn't seem to me that you're going to end up with a lot more true theories. It seems like to me you're going to fall into either not believing anything or believing some crazy stuff. But to me, the thought that I have to take anything on authority, I admit it, but it's really galling, right? I would like to be able to figure out everything myself to see why it's true. I just don't know that that's possible. And the same with luck. There are all kinds of historical myths. Science gets it wrong sometime, and then we have to wait for future science to correct it. There's also all kinds of historical myths that turns out everybody accepts as true and they turn out to be false, right? One I'm thinking of, if you guys have ever heard of the Kitty Genovese case, this is just one that randomly occurs to me. A woman who supposedly screamed for help for an hour while her neighbors listened and didn't call the cops. It turns out that that's complete bull, right? Her neighbors actually did call the cops. One of them actually ran down and tried to help her. And the newspaper printed this lie that one of the police investigators told him because it was a good story. And for 50 years, people have believed this, and most people still believe it, right? Things like that are going to happen. Authorities are not infallible. But I don't see any way around relying on them. Anyway. So I see why Descartes wants what he wants, and I see the problems he's trying to deal with. It just seems to me that the route he takes gets you into more serious problems than it actually solves. What I do want to do, though, now, in the future lectures, is to talk about some other skeptical arguments, right? Some other arguments that we don't know anything. Now, the problem with Descartes, to me, is that Descartes completely misstates the burden of proof, right? He thinks that, if he can raise the possibility we might be wrong, any kind of possibility, then we don't have any real claims to knowledge. That doesn't seem to me to be enough. But if Descartes or another sort of skeptic could show us a case where it's not just possible we're wrong, but there's good reason to think, that the worry they have in mind might be the case, might be true, well then, that might be a more serious reason to be a skeptic, to doubt that we have claims to knowledge, right? If there were something that's not just like, oh, it might be space aliens, but it was more like, oh, well, here is all this evidence this other guy did it. If there was a skeptical worry like that we would have to take a lot more seriously. So I think the burden of proof is on the skeptic, this person who says we have no knowledge, or who says we're just really completely top to bottom mistaken about what we think is true and what the world is like. But what if the skeptic can make his case? What if, instead of just throwing the burden of proof back on us or setting it insanely high, they could actually make a case? So Bostrom's simulation argument. Bostrom thinks we're living in a computer simulation, or at least that it's very likely we are. And Bostrom doesn't just throw it out there and says, prove me wrong, kids, you can't do it. Bostrom actually says, well, here's all these reasons to think computer simulation is more likely than the alternative, we're living in the real world. He might not be right about that. A lot of people have criticized him. But he gives us a positive argument we should take the possibility seriously. The problem of testimony being that we, to gain knowledge about the world, pretty much unavoidably sometimes or very often have to take the word of others. When we see some of the problems that arise with testimony, that also might give us more positive reasons to take these skeptical doubts seriously.